Now, Africa remains a complex and challenging environment in which to do business, and making well-informed choices about which markets to enter and via which mode is crucial. This is according to Ernst & Young's Africa by Numbers report, which was released today. Joining us in studio is Sylvester Taku, Associate Director at the Africa Business Center for More. Thank you so much for making the time to join me this evening. Now, one of the findings of the report, of course, is looking at foreign direct investment flows across the continent. Let's look at the drivers that are driving the increase in FDI that we're seeing across the continent.
Wow, that's a good one. So what are the drivers? I must first of all emphasize that the report has been based on interviewing executives, over 500 of them in 38 different countries, to survey what is happening within that space. The drivers would be, I think, is the political stability that has been happening in sub-Saharan Africa and across Africa, and the reduction in poverty, but also I think the youthful population and the growth of that population. So the middle class has been growing. Those would be the drivers. But the report has really been focused to see how is the FDI investments flow into sub-Saharan Africa.
Of course, understanding that the report's also focused on the 8 top performing countries in terms of attracting FDI. But from those 8 countries, can we pick out certain sectors and say these are the sectors that have been attracting the lion's share of FDI?
All right. So in the case of South Africa, it would be a good third, one third of that is in automotive, is in renewable energy, and the services sector, right? So in South Africa, it's quite diversified, whereas in countries like Angola and Nigeria, it's still predominantly is in the oil and gas sector, which is high capital intensive. Hence, you'd see those two probably come above South Africa in terms of the capital invested, whereas South Africa, in terms of the number of projects, is still number one in sub-Saharan Africa, and Africa for that matter.
Oftentimes, we hear reportage about South Africa losing ground as the gateway into continent and being surpassed by Nigeria and other fast-growing markets. How does the report reflect on that? All
right, so those are perceptions, right? The facts actually would show that South Africa still remains their gateway to Africa. And some of those reasons is obvious, right? South Africa is coming from a very high base, even in terms of looking at the FDI numbers and look at the growth rate, which is at 22.4 in South Africa, but if you look at the base, it's coming from a high base and still growing by that much. But another part of it, the South African economy is very diversified. Our capital markets are still top rated in the world for that matter, so our regulatory environment. So because of that and the infrastructure as well, you can't ignore the infrastructure, which is a real driver of economic growth or sustainable economic growth. South Africa still surpasses the rest of the continent by far. So Nigeria is making strides in terms of the GDP quantum, but it's not only GDP that makes an economy a gateway or the most attractive investment destination.
Let's look at some long-term forecasts, if we may. Firstly, is South Africa likely to retain this dominant positions against the other 7 countries? And are there any other countries that you are expecting to join the ranks of the 8 top performers in FDI?
So South Africa, yes, would most likely for the foreseeable future, at least that's what the facts are indicating, would maintain its position as the dominant economy in Africa, again because of the base, again because of the infrastructure development. And yes, the economies that are catching up in the top 8 or top 9, you would know that in terms of the FME is, I'm saying it now again in French, right? No, but the top 11 of the 20 fastest growing economies are in Africa. So already in that, you start including your likes of Mozambique, which is growing very, very fast, right? So it's to say it's not just 8, it's actually 11, which are the fastest growing economies in the world in
Let's look at South Africa's role as an FDI player on the continent. How much foreign direct investment are we seeing flowing into the rest of the continent from South Africa?
That's a very interesting question, because if you strip out the investments into South Africa itself, South Africa is actually the top investor into the rest of Africa. But if you include all the other nations, it's number 5 investor into the rest of the African continent. So South Africa on its own, South African corporates or headquartered companies are investing rapidly into the rest of the African continent, which is important. And if you look at the quantum, compounded is grown, is a good 562% in the decade, right? And if you look at from 2002 to now, it's doubled, is five times that.
Are
So
there
it's
any
growing really rapidly.
Are there any concerns that the report picks up that could see a dip in FDI inflows onto the continent?
Into the continent, the biggest constraint is obviously the infrastructure development. You'll know that Africa still has a huge gap if you compare it with other developing economies, other emerging economies in terms of its infrastructure. So that's the biggest concern. But integration, regional integration also is an important factor that needs to happen faster for this growth to continue and to be sustainable, right? The connectivity of the rest of the African continent. Policy harmonization across the African continent. We must note that it's 54 countries, different regulations. So the regional integration needs to happen much faster for these trends to continue and to be sustainable, I would say.
I've got less than a minute left. From where you stand and from the report, are we seeing that policies are geared and effectively responding to some of these challenges that you've just mentioned?
So the regional integration is a strong focus, and I think the government has made that quite clear. The NDP, in the preamble of the NDP, talks about South Africa being part of Africa and be viewed from that perspective. So I think there are a lot of strides that are being made. The implementation and the scaling up of that would determine how soon it becomes realizable.
Sylvester